Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we're going to be finishing up our look at the 5 ARB professional criteria. So let's go. Okay guys, so finally we're there, we're looking at PC5. I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a slow process. There's a lot of other life things happening, obviously, because we are still in the shack. There's a lot going on in the background, but hopefully this video is helpful and kind of ties up all of our look at the professional criteria. As usual, it's kind of high level. It's also looking at whether you will have studied these things already in your education or have seen them in professional practice, or whether they're things that you'll be taught at part 3. So we're going to look at that through each of the 10 criteria for PC5. Okay, first up is 5.1, which is procurement methods, including for public and larger projects and relevant legislation. So unless you, well, let's first of all say procurement methods is said here, then like comma. So it's quite a big topic in itself, and we'll probably do a separate video on procurement methods. I'm only really going to touch on it kind of lightly here. Unless you are working in stage 5 a lot in your practice, and obviously specifically this is related to public and larger projects. So unless you're doing that kind of work in your practice, then you're going to have very narrow experience of how this is done. But I wouldn't worry about that, because everything covered under PC5 is a major part of what you're taught at your part 3. I've said in the past that part 3 is teaching you the architect's legal relationships to other people in the construction industry, their legal situation and their requirements, also the situation with an architect and their regard to risk, what decisions they make or don't make because of their relationship to risk. And then building procurement contracts for on-site work is a massive part of what you get taught at your part 3. So how procurement methods work, how tendering works, different kinds of contracts and the differences between them. We're going to touch on that a bit throughout this video, but just to say, don't worry if this is something that you don't have massive experience of, because it's something that you're going to be taught. But as also I always say, try and get on-site experience. If your office is doing anything on-site, it would be great for you to be involved in it in some way, even if it's shadowing a project, because the kind of experience you get from seeing something happen on site is completely different to trying to read about it and learn about it. Okay, so with that said, procurement methods. So there are 2 main types that are going to be touched on at your part 3, and 2 main types that are used in the construction industry. And these are traditional and design and build. So in 2018, 46% of contracts were traditional contracts and 41% were design and build. So that's 87% of contracts in the whole construction industry that are those 2. There are other kinds. There's like construction management contracting, PFI, PPP agreements, framework agreements. We'll touch on some of those again in this video. But traditional and design and build are the main 2 that you're going to know. And if you're like me, when I was doing my part 3 the first time, I worked for a very small practice. We didn't often do work on site. When we did, it would definitely be under a traditional contract. And I didn't really understand how a design and build contract works, or what the difference between the 2 of them are. And then obviously when I started working for Allies & Morrison, the majority of their work is under design and build contracts. So it's great, again, if to get that experience yourself if you can, or if not, try and find a study group that has people who come from those different worlds, and then you can kind of fill out your experience. So in terms of procurement methods, a traditional procurement method or a design and build procurement method are the 2 main types. In this video, I'm going to try not to use procurement and contract interchangeably, because they are different, but they are closely linked. We're going to be also referring a lot to the book Which Contract, which I'll probably bring up again in a minute, and some other books that would be great for you to have a look at. And I'm going to show you some resources in this video, and there'll be a link in the description below to where you can see them. Instead of me just flashing them up on the screen, you can take a bit of time to look at them. But moving on, that's general procurement. The second part of 5.1 is including for public and larger projects and relevant legislation that governs those. So this is because of any sort of government work, essentially. So public meaning public authorities, such as government departments or local authorities. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be looking at my notes because I want to make sure that it's kind of like covering most things that I have noted to talk about. So obviously, because these are public authorities, the process of procuring them, which sort of means tendering and arranging what contract they're going to work under, must be transparent in how they award tenders and make sure that they encourage competition. So essentially it's to try and prevent corruption and backhanders. Not that in my opinion that still doesn't happen, but it is under control under these rules essentially. So procurement, and so as I've said, procurement for public projects is about fairness and a level playing field. And if the monetary value is over a certain amount, it also has to be advertised as a completely open tender. So that used to be done on OJU, which is the official journal of the European Union. And now in the UK, it's done under FTS, which is Find a Tender, which is a system basically where you publish tenders for public procurement and anybody can bid on those tenders. So yeah, also public bodies often procure people through that process of issuing a tender to something like FTS for a framework. And a framework is when they have certain people they've already picked and then they tender to them directly. So instead of it being a completely open tender. But again, as I say, that depends on the monetary value of that tender. And we're not going to go into super detail of it here. If you want more information, we can do a separate video on it. Okay, so legislation here. Again, I think it's a little bit vague for my liking, so it'd be something you want to confirm at part 3. I think it's a two-part thing of the legislation. The first is the value, which then has to be an open tender, so put on FTS, the government's kind of tendering service, when that is in place, because that is a rule of how that has to be tendered. Otherwise, tender information tends to follow common law, which again is about kind of fairness and how tenders are conducted. So any compliant tender that's received before a certain deadline has to be considered as a part of a process. So there's things like you can't just arbitrarily remove people from a tender, you can't ask people to readjust their prices like kind of backhandedly, you know, you can't say, oh, if you put in this lower price you'll definitely win the tender. Anything like that is obviously something that not everybody in the tender is aware of, and therefore it's kind of unfair, and therefore it's against sort of tendering legislation and common law practices, so someone could sue you for not giving them a fair chance to tender. So professional guidance that people use are things like this, which is the JCT tendering practice note. So basically some of these things have been accepted by the courts as kind of the rules of tendering. And as I say, I think that's the second part of what they mean by legislation in 5.1. The first part being what things have to be open tendered, what value of projects have to be open tendered. And I am not an expert in any of that, so your part 3 course will teach you that more. But if you want more of a video and I'll go and like deep dive into all of these topics, we totally can do that. The main thing is within tenders, the fairness, such as what is kind of laid out there in the JCT's practice notes. There's general rules that people abide to. The RIBA and RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, they also have these kind of things, with basically the intention to not bring the construction industry in disrepute. So don't do things that are, you know, sneaky, illegal, unfair, etc. Obviously. But there's no like major rules governing tendering other than those kind of practice notes and things that have been done by the courts, because as we've touched on before in the ARB's professional criteria, you need to understand about English law for your part 3 in a very general sense. And if you know anything about English law, you'll know that essentially it's usually set by precedent. So what is found to be enough evidence or not in court, or a rule in court or not in the past, is then what is usually used as a basis precedent in the future if other things are brought to court. So common law is the basis, and then on top of that there's kind of good practice information as well. There's a second part of the legislation thing, which is what needs to be tendered openly. If it's a government or public body, then I believe all their tenders pretty much have to be open tenders, other than if they are tendering directly to their own framework agreement. So contractors who they've already chosen. Sorry, I'm moving my notes around like an idiot. Contractors that they've already chosen to sit on their framework. So one example of that is like councils. Local councils often have a framework of people who provide things like maintenance for them. Or, you know, they might have a framework of architects who repair previous council house buildings and stuff for them. Those architects, you know, however many architects' offices might sit on a framework, and so then if there is a job to uplift an area, then the council can tender it, depending on the value, just to their framework instead of openly. And so they're architects that they've kind of already vetted, already picked, and it makes the tendering process easier and a bit faster because they're not having to kind of check and research all of those companies. So that is 5.1. 5.2 is the effects of different procurement processes on programme cost, risk and quality. So we've spoken about that kind of trifactor in the past, and now we're adding programme into there as well, speed, as they talk about it in Which Contract. So a great reference for this topic is the book Which Contract, which I have here. This is my 5th edition. I'm going to show you some pages from this in a minute. This is not the most current. There's a 6th edition now, which I'll link in the description below. But basically this gives you all the information you're going to need for this kind of question, and for a lot of PC5 it's a really good resource. It's not the easiest book to read, but it's good to dip into for certain questions, and then it does give you a lot more detail about a lot of kinds of contracts and the differences between them. But the first few pages are a great kind of setup. So the stuff I'm going to show you comes from that and comes from the first few pages. So basically the point of 5.2 here is to understand the effect of different procurement processes on those factors: program, cost, risk and quality. This is important because as an architect you need to know that you are advising your client correctly on the best kind of procurement based on their concerns, their like immediate concerns of those 4 types, and obviously there's a few more as well. Obviously, as we've kind of touched upon in 5.1, there can be lawsuits from tendering or badly advising clients on procurement if you lead them down a path that later just turns out to be something that is causing more issues in how they're procuring a building, how they're constructing a building, than would have been another way. Then you could be found to be sort of negligent for doing that. So it's it's needed for you to understand these things, and obviously that's why the ARB are asking you to make sure that you understand the difference so that you can become an architect. Okay, so this image shows the risk apportioned by types of procurement. So with design and build, more risk is on the contractor, and how much risk is on either the contractor or the client depends on the type of design and build process that's being used, whether the contractor is doing a full package or whether they have input at the design stage or just input at the design stage. These things make a difference. The most balanced in terms of risk is the traditional lump sum procurement route, as you can see here, which in this particular example allows for fluctuations, or a traditional measurement procurement route with a bill of approximate quantities. These are more risky for the contractor or the client respectively, but they're generally much more balanced, and you can see that from this diagram, which, as I say, is from the Which Contract, my 5th edition. Okay, so the main thing to understand from this is that different types of procurement and different types of contract apportion risk differently, and obviously risk, the key word again that we're dealing with all the way through our part 3 situation. So classically, contracts aimed at domestic clients are usually weighted with more risk towards the contractor, as the client's assumed to be inexperienced, and traditional is the most traditional, weirdly, for domestic projects. And so it does kind of put more risk towards the contractor, but again, there has been a lot of work to try and balance it so that it isn't unfairly risky towards the contractor, because that would be unfair terms of a contract. And we've talked about contract a long time ago in the past, but the same rules govern a construction contract as they do an architect's appointment. There needs to be fairness. It needs to be fairly weighted, depending on someone's ability to control the situation. So the second extract here is from page 46 and 47 of Which Contract, and it shows a general breakdown of factors by procurement method. So you can see, obviously, I've drawn on this in the past, probably during my part 3. Basically, it's given a breakdown by speed, time, so, program, basically, is that. Speed/time, cost and quality, as well as other factors as well, such as the flexibility, the certainty, responsibility, risk. So all these things that are really relevant if you're trying to choose a procurement route and you know best what building it is that you've designed, how much potential risk there is in it for the contractor and for the client, what kind of quality the client is looking for out of it. So all of these factors are something that to be aware of. You should be able to then choose the best procurement route. I was looking at a friend of mine's part 3 the other day, helping them go through the exam questions, and one of them was pretty much about this, was about, okay, well, we'd suggested to the client design and build, and quality is a major concern of the client. And basically later on in the exam, the questions was assumed now that you're doing a traditional contract. So we were looking at this question and thinking, well, obviously you're supposed to get to the outcome that you're supposed to be saying to them that a traditional contract would be best for them. So again, their quality is a major thing, and traditional contracts are seen as the ones that do allow more for quality. So yeah, as I said, basically all the extracts I've just shown from Which Contract, they're going to be available in the link below, probably via my website. I don't know, you're seeing this in the future, so you know how you can get them. But so that they're not just flashed up on screen, you can take a look at them properly. Otherwise, I would imagine those same tables, potentially updated, are in Which Contract, the 6th edition. Like I say, also linked below, but before buying it, see if you can get it anywhere or have a look at a copy of it. Okay, 5.3 is collaboration in construction and provision for team working. This topic is often discussed at part 3, and again, will be something you probably don't have a lot of experience of unless you are on site with a lot of projects and different varied projects. So you're seeing a change in collaboration depending on procurement and the contract that you're using. So in 1994, the Latham Report investigated the construction industry and found the industry was ineffective, adversarial, fragmented, and incapable of delivering for its customers. And the report then proposed that there needed to be a change of culture towards greater partnering and teamwork across the industry. So this is something that, again, my friend doing his part 3 recently needed to reference for some of his answers. So basically, there was found to be failings in the construction industry that led to very aggressive disputes between clients, contractors, contract administrators, and basically heralded a bit of a change into how we actually run a project on site. These findings were then reinforced subsequently by the Egon report in 1998, which was called Rethinking Construction. So it looked at this issue as well. I'm going to touch on this really lightly because you are going to be taught this at your part 3, but basically, it was another thing about not unfairly making contracts risky for one person or one party and making things a sort of done deal in the sense that maybe a contractor will be blamed for failings on site. One of the outcomes with this was the NEC3, which is a type of contract used on quite large projects, but the suite of NEC3 is supposed to be able to be used on any kind of project. I am not personally an expert in it, but essentially it encourages collaboration between the team members instead of blaming each other for either failings or oversights. The idea is that everybody's working together. So those kind of contracts came out of these issues in collaboration in the construction industry and trying to prevent disputes. We're going to get to dispute resolution later in PC5, but essentially trying to make sure that things run as smoothly on site as possible and you don't get to a point where you are getting into sort of either dispute resolution or litigation, and that really you're trying to resolve things within the team and within contracts. Okay, so that's kind of quick for 5.3, but we can touch on that more if you want in other videos. I'm just conscious of trying to get through these videos a little bit quicker and get it up for you guys. So 5.4 is tendering methods, codes, procedures, and project planning. So we've already mentioned this a little bit in 5.1, but tendering methods include a single stage tender, a 2-stage tender, negotiated tender. Those are like some of the main kinds of tendering. Again, Which Contract is an excellent book for this because it's about obviously which contract you run procurement under. But procurement covers the tendering process and also the appointment, well, the choosing of a contract and then the appointment of the parties to that contract. So those are the main ways of tendering things. They are kind of literally as they're described. A single stage tender is a package of information with enough detail in it, dependent on the contract type that you're using, to ensure a kind of a good idea of price and a good idea for the contractor of what the works will include. 2-stage tendering is exactly the same thing, but with 2 stages and 2 lots of information. Usually a first lot of information, then more detailed set. Negotiated tenders is more when you are, well, literally again, as it sounds, trying to negotiate tender with specific contractors using the information that you've already compiled. And that again depends on your procurement method as to how much information the design team has prepared before you're tendering. It also depends on what contract you're planning to do. Design and build can be quite different depending on what kind of design and build you're using. So like a traditional procurement process is the traditional, as we've already said, which is what people would normally think of, I think, especially people training to be architects. Well, you've got an architect, they've worked on the project for, a long period of time. In this situation, usually up to stage 4 of the RIBA work stages. You're then preparing technical construction information, usually for building control and then also for tendering. And they're usually sort of 2 different levels of information that you probably need, maybe a little bit more detail, hopefully a bit more detail for the tender. What you want to do is provide the contractor with enough information for them to provide a good price and for that price to then not need to change. So the more information you give, the more specific the price can be. But obviously it's also a double-edged sword in giving slightly too much information for things that you're maybe not so specific about. It's also how you can control quality and how much detail you give of what you expect there to be as the outcome of the project. So yeah, they're the main kinds of tendering: single stage, 2-stage, and negotiated. Then there's other ways of getting a contractor, such as open tendering, which we've spoken about for public procurement, selective tendering, or single contractor selection. So depending again on what kind of project it is and whether it's a kind of procurement of such a value or a public job that requires to be openly tendered. Otherwise, you can selectively tender, or you can just choose a contractor to work with from the outset. For an architect, it's important that you are clear about this with a client. If you have a contractor you work with regularly who you want to use, you have to tell the client that's the case. And if they want to tender to more places, and personally you'd want at least 2 or more prices to be able to compare things, then that's their right to then say, oh no, I want more of a tender than just this person who's your mate, because that isn't really giving them necessarily the best deal. And the point is, you're the client's agent, and you need to be giving them the best possible service you can, and also not being biased in any way. But yes, there's many more types than this. Public procurement, as we've spoken about. Framework tendering, which is basically like an approved supplier list. We've talked about that a little bit. And serial tendering, which is kind of like a hybrid system. There's a lot of tendering methods, but the main ones you're going to need to know is like single, 2-stage, and negotiated tenders. So it says codes, procedures, and project planning. So as we've already touched upon, there is obviously we've talked about the legislation in terms of public procurement, but in terms of tendering codes and procedures, then this is a great resource, and then the RIBA and the RICS. So RICS has tendering strategies, JCT here has the 2017 practice note. There's also a British standard, which is construction procurement policies, strategies and procedures, codes of practice. There's another British standard, which is collaborative business relationships, and there's the MBS guide to tendering for construction projects. So if you're doing like an MBS specification, MBS also give information on tendering for construction projects, and a kind of general industry standard of codes and procedures, the best practice ways of doing that. So those are what you would refer to. So most district councils, government bodies, and also universities have their own codes of procurement and practice, following basically the industry best practice, but laying out basically what they will and will not do, just so that's clear for anybody who might tender on any of the projects that they put out. Okay, so the last part of 5.4 is project planning, which depends on the tender option and the procurement method, but I've already touched on that basically, like single-stage tendering, 2-stage tendering. So even if you look at just the difference between those, if you're going to be putting out 1 tender pack as opposed to 2 tender packs, then obviously that makes a difference in how long the tendering process itself is going to take, and then how long you're going to need to give people to reply to those tenders. And then you're going to need to review the tenders and present to your client the tender results and the options that they have. And obviously all of that is going to have an impact on the construction time of the project as well, because if it's going to take you longer to appoint a contractor, then it's going to take you longer to start on site, and therefore it's going to take a longer time before you're finished on site. So this is why PC5 is really trying to talk, obviously the title of it is building procurement, and it's really trying to explain that the procurement method is a key part of the construction project. And different procurement methods will yield different results on site, but also, as we've already touched on, different times, different program implications, costs and quality, as well as other, responsibility, risk, etc., everything we've touched on. So again, which contract is a great place to look at all of this. And it also looks at how those things are going to have an impact on the project and the planning of it and the time it's going to take. Okay, so 5.5 is forms of contract and subcontract, design responsibility, and third-party rights. So we'll take these kind of individually. And again, this is kind of high level, and they could mean a lot of things, but you're going to be taught this at your part 3. And like I say, unless you're working on site, you are very unlikely to have a good grasp of this already. But basically, forms of contract, obviously we've spoken about types of procurement that then lead into types of contracts, such as traditional and design and build. Within those, there are things such as a fixed price contract, and the fixed price contract revolves around one lump sum agreed between the project owner and the contractor, so client and contractor. Cost plus fixed percentage contract, which is basically the cost is worked out on a percentage rate of what is done. And then times and material contract, which is what it sounds like, you're paid for time and materials. Those are kind of 3 main types. There's also, when they say forms of contract, there's how a contract is executed as well, but we're not really going to touch on that now, and if you want more detail about that, we're talk about that in another video. So yeah, forms of contract, basically we've spoken about the ways of procuring and the different kinds of procurement. And then the forms of the contract, as I say, maybe fixed price, cost plus, time and materials. There's some main types. They also say types of subcontract or forms of subcontract. And there are 3 kinds of subcontractors in the construction industry. And they're nominated subcontractors, domestic subcontractors, or named subcontractors. So domestic subcontractors are those that a contractor themselves chooses and appoints. Nominated is when a client has said such as these, and named is when they've said specifically that person or that company, essentially, is the simple way of explaining it for the purposes of this video. The next part is design responsibility. So this is important because design responsibilities during construction need to be clearly defined and properly understood before any tender documentation is prepared or any appointments are made. This is because this might include for contractor designed portions within the contract, and then who is going to take on the responsibility for that design is very important in terms of the legal situation of that design and who's responsible for it. So usually we see a design responsibility matrix for this, which basically gives each element of the design and each stage of the design development process what level of detail it's going to be done to. It might be accompanied by a kind of contractual tree situation illustrating the contractual relationships between the participants of the project. It can also be accompanied by a project roles table as well, which shows you what everybody on site is doing and what, kind of like a job description, what they should be doing, and then what is clearly outside of their remit. And so you should try and set up a design responsibility matrix as soon in the project as possible, so really early on in the design stages. If something is then taken out of the design to be put into such as like a contractor design portion in a contract, then that should be made clear in the design responsibility matrix. And the client might find that for them it's easier to appoint a kind of lead designer and a lead consultant who will coordinate the work of the rest of the design team. Again, this depends on the sheer scale of the job and whether or not that's kind of relevant. But it's best practice for jobs generally. If the contractor's doing a contractor designed portion, they might appoint their own design managers to coordinate their work and to submit it to the client and also to a contract administrator if there is such a person. Okay, so third-party rights we have spoken about in the past. I can't remember which of the professional criteria it was that we spoke about third-party rights, but we have. If you remember that, basically third-party rights is assigning someone the rights to the contract that is between two parties. So in this instance, if you have a construction contract between the client and the contractor, third-party rights is giving someone else kind of access to certain parts of that contract. And I think the reason it's being brought up here in 5.5 is because they have mentioned subcontractors. So subcontractors might have third-party rights to parts of the contract to be able to have protection under the contract of their work. And third-party rights is something we usually see tied in with collateral warranties, which aren't mentioned here, but it would be kind of relevant potentially depending on the subcontract situation and whether the subcontractor, what their relationship is to the contractor. All these things are kind of contractual relationships. Which contract is honestly the best place to look for pretty much all of this information. But basically a collateral warranty, as we've again touched on in the past, is a way for someone to have a legal relationship with someone that they wouldn't otherwise have a legal relationship with. And that's why we usually see it mentioned alongside third-party rights. But yeah, here I would say that third-party rights is referring to the rights of the subcontractors. Okay, 5.6 is application and use of contract documentation. Again, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be quick because it feels like every single one of these under PC5 could be like a whole video in itself. This is kind of a bit of an ambiguous title, but I think it's really just asking what makes up the contract documentation and obviously the use of it. So this is the This is easiest explained for the two main types, as we can clearly see their differences. So traditional contracts and design and build, as we've already mentioned. You might have experienced these if you are part of a team preparing a contract or you've worked on the construction stages of a project. But as I've said, if you can get any on-site shadowing work or exposure to what's going on site, then you definitely should do. Okay, so under traditional, the application and use of contract documentation under traditional procurement, the contract documents as with all contract documents, to be fair, set out the obligations and responsibilities of parties of the contract. On a traditional procured, fully designed construction project, the documents are likely to include some of the following. One of the things there to note is fully designed. As we've already mentioned, traditional procurement, it's kind of presuming the traditional pathway, which is that the project was designed, then it's tendered, and then a contractor gives you a price of how much it's going to be constructed for, and then if you accept that price, they're the person who's being contracted to do the works. Usually an architect is maintained as a contract administrator on those jobs, but we're going to touch on that in a bit more detail, not necessarily an architect. But basically, if you're assuming that kind of situation, then what information you'd usually get is, one part of that is the working drawings, which we've talked about. Obviously they're fully designed and that's what you've tendered. How much detail you've put into those is what's going to govern what quality of work you get and how much information the contractor's basing their price on, and anything that's a change to that is going to be a change to that. Articles of agreement, basically the contract itself, which is the agreement, and whether that's going to be executed as a simple contract or as a deed, that's kind of a piece of information in itself. So if you want to talk about that, we'll talk about that another time. A bill of quantities, specifications such as MBS specification, just specifying materials that you would like them to use, which the builder then is to price for, and certain finishes as well. Schedule of works, which is obviously just a schedule of everything that needs to be done. There might also, depending on the design process and how much has been designed to tender or what is ongoing, there might be an information release schedule of when further information will be given to the contractor. One of the things with this is that that's something that a contractor can use to set their program against, but if you're late in the delivery of your information, it's also something they can claim an extension of time against because you were late in providing information. So that's, again, a different topic. If you want to go into traditional contracts and how they work, we can talk about that in another video. And then it would also set out in the contract documentation the requirement for a contractor to obtain collateral warranties from any subcontractors or any suppliers that they might be using. Again, we've touched on collateral warranties in the past. And that's a whole other video as well if you want to know about collateral warranties a bit more. And then basically the client and the contractor would sign the contract with witnesses and agree a commencement of the work date. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rechecking my notes, and essentially that is kind of the process of a traditional. So you've got your documentation, which is what the contractor is pricing against in their tender, and then that information becomes kind of set as the contract. It becomes part of the contract documentation. So if you're referring to the drawings, you're referring to those. If there's an update to them, that's issued and then replaces the piece that was already in the pack. The contract itself, which when you're learning part 3 and when you're learning contract law, you'll just learn that most questions you refer to the contract. The contract that you've agreed to use, which is part of the procurement, governs how you're going to deal with a lot of situations on site, and so you would need to do those in accordance with the contract that everyone signed. Bills of quantity, specifications, schedules of work, they're all kind of additional information to back up that drawing pack, and then an information release schedule if you're going to still be releasing information, so the contractor's aware of what's going to be sent to them and when. And then you need to be aware of whether or not then that's going to have any implications, as I say, on extensions of time or also changes to the cost of the contract. So that is for traditional. That's the use of contract documentation and the purposes of it, the application of it, which is how I've interpreted that for 5.6. So then looking at the most other standard contract type is design and build. On design and build projects, the contract documents may comprise of the article of agreement or conditions of contract. So as we've said, again, the contract type. So that could be something like a JCT, design and build. Whatever it is, that's the rules that's going to govern how you go forward throughout the construction project. The employer's requirements, which are essentially usually prepared by the design team, and it's the same as the working drawings from the traditional contract. It's you saying, this is what we want, here we've drawn out everything that we care about, and usually also with a list of like, this is what needs to be done. And then, because it's design and build, the contractor's proposals. So their proposals for certain things, and as long as it is compliant with the employer's requirements, they can do things kind of in the way that they want to, as long as it fulfills the employer's requirements. And then a contract sum analysis usually, and possibly a bill of quantities, maybe for some of the design and maybe not all of it. but maybe all of it. You know, it depends on the contract type and the procurement route that you have agreed. And then signing the contract for the design and build, same as with the traditional. So again, witnessed, and it depends on how it's going to be executed, but you're agreeing to a start date and therefore you're agreeing to an end date, and anything that then changes in between that is all governed by the contract that you're using for that project. So that's the application use of contract documentation. That's all usually followed by a pre-contract site meeting or a kick-off meeting where everybody meets. Everybody meets on site, and you make sure that basically everyone has all of that information and that you're using it. And yeah, that is 5.6. Point 7 is the roles of design and construction team members and their interaction. So for this, again, I'm going to refer to which contract because it has some really good organizational diagrams in the beginning that show the relationships between different parties dependent on the different procurement and different contract route that you've taken. But a general list of construction team members would be obviously the client, the main contractor, and an architect, often also project manager, subcontractors, quantity surveyors, a contract administrator that may or may not be an architect, other design consultants such as landscape, interior, etc., structural engineer, and a building inspector as well, who would usually work from kind of the contractor's side, doing obviously building control, but they're an independent person. Basically, if you see these organizational diagrams from which contract, they kind of show you how these roles are arranged. So they're kind of all of the roles. If I'm talking about 5.7, they're the roles of the design and construction team members. What they're doing obviously is a lot more in depth. We're going to touch on that, to be honest, in a few more of the topics, for PC5. So I think basically referring to which contract here is the best thing to do. Essentially what you need to bear in mind is that 5.7 is asking about their interaction, and it's their interaction that's going to change dependent on what kind of procurement or contract route you're taking. So whilst the roles of designers and construction team members all remain similar, it's their interaction with each other that changes because of the procurement. I can totally talk. The procurement method and the contract that's in place. So these are some examples from which contract, and insert examples. And then we're going to move on because otherwise this is a rabbit hole of a hell of a lot of information. If you want more information, please do tell me in the comments below. And if this video even makes half sense, then honestly, we're fucking winning. Okay, 5.8, duties and powers of a lead consultant and a contract administrator. So as with everything in PC5, unless you've experienced it directly, it's unlikely that you have any experience of this. But as also with everything, it's something that's heavily focused on during any Part 3 course, so don't worry about that. The main thing here is that it's asking you to understand how these roles are different, and they are different, and they are not to be confused with each other, essentially. So again, I'm going to read to you from my notes, so you're so lucky. Basically, a lead consultant is just that, the main point of contact for all consultants. They're responsible for the coordination of the work, as well as monitoring and reviewing the work of the whole consultant team. That consultant team is specialist designers and specialist contractors. It depends on how you're procuring a building, what contract you're using as to who is in that consultant team, but the lead consultant is responsible for making sure that all of that work is pulled together. They may also prepare and manage the project program and arrange team meetings. They will seek instructions from the client and advise the client on procurement routes, as well as reviewing the returned tenders. So obviously a lead consultant there has a lot of roles that would usually be done by an architect, so a lead consultant may well be an architect. So essentially 5.8 is asking you what's an architect doing and what's a contract administrator, and making sure you understand that they're two different roles, even if they're being carried out by the same person. So this role a lead consultant role does seem to start to reflect a lot of the work of a project manager. However, there's a key difference. A project manager would usually act as the client on their behalf, whereas a lead consultant coordinates the activities of other team members and they defer to the client for instructions and decisions. So if you think about being an architect day to day, you're not doing things for your client without them being aware of it. You're presenting options and information to them for their decision and their input. Whereas a project manager can often act on the client's behalf with their interests in mind because they have a different relationship with the client. So it's different. Okay, so that's a lead consultant, often an architect, and that's their role. I'm sorry if you can hear it started raining. So the shack is very noisy. Okay, so the second part of this is contract administrator. So a contract administrator might often also be an architect, but it's different, and they might be being a lead consultant and a contract administrator at the same time, but they're two different roles, and they need to have them be different in their own mind and from their own perspective. So it's trying to make sure that you, if you have passed your part 3, you understand they're two different roles and you're carrying them out separately, even whilst you're doing both, so you're the same human person. Okay, so contract administrator. It's quite self-explanatory. The contract administrator is responsible for administering the terms of the building contract that everybody has agreed to. Usually that is a traditional contract, because there's a different role on a design and build. So we're assuming here that it's traditional. So they're responsible for administering the terms of the building contract between the contracting parties. And the contracting parties are really the employer, so the client, and the contractor. So the employer has delegated the administration of the construction contract to the contract administrator. And this person may be the project architect, as I've said, but they may also be a different lead consultant or a cost consultant, a specialist consultant, or another employer's agent. They could be a project manager or an engineer. They could be basically anyone. There's someone who the employer said, you need to do this role of contract administration. Now, the key part of this is that this person has been appointed by the client. However, it's very important when they're certifying and giving assessments or decisions, they should act honestly and reasonably with impartiality. Their decisions are usually open to challenges via the dispute resolution process of the contract. So they need to make sure they're acting fairly. One of the main roles of a contract administrator is that they are issuing interim certificates on site, which is certifying work that has been completed in accordance with the contract, and then they're telling the employer, this is what the contractor has done and this is how much you owe him. And when you are doing that work, it has to be fair. You can't be acting for your employer and saying, oh, we're not paying you for that. If it's there and it's done in accordance with the contract, the employer is paying for it. You have to be able to mediate that relationship between the employer and the contractor. The whole reason a contract administrator exists is what we were talking about earlier, which is collaboration in the construction industry. And without them, there tends to be disagreements between the person paying and the person building. So the contract administrator is there as a middle ground, and they are a person who is trying to coordinate all of that situation, administer both sides, and do so fairly. Now, it's very useful if that person is the architect who designed the whole project, because they know what is and is not in accordance with the design that the employer/client. It's employer in the contract, but it's usually your client. What it is that they want to get built, you know that, and you've worked on it, so you know what is and is not in line with the contract. But also you're trying to make sure the contractor completes this job, stays on this job, and also it's a business that they make money from the job. So you have to be fair from both sides and make sure that you administer a contract with fairness uppermost in what you do. So some of the things a contract administrator does is see construction for the client in relation to the contract or any changes to the contract. They issue instructions such as variations. Often that's called an architect's instruction, which is asking for a variation to what was agreed in the contract. So say a door was somewhere in the contract documentation that we've talked about, and then you're going to move it. That's a variation and it's a change to the contract. So it needs to be recorded, because otherwise we're basically going on that information that was originally issued, which we've already spoken about. They consider claims such as extensions of time claims. That is a massive thing that almost always comes up in your part 3. They will give you a load of requests for extension of time from a contractor, again presuming this is a traditional contract thing, and then you will need to assess those claims and consider which you might award or not. I don't know, I think I have somewhere else in my notes, but I'm going to mention it now. Extension of time also is for an extension of time to the contract. It's often then also accompanied by a loss or expense claim. So often if there's like an extension of time, it might have costed the contractor more. And if you award that extension of time, you might also award some money to them for it. But those are separate claims, just something to mention now in case I forget. The contract administrator might chair progress meetings. They issue certificates of practical completion and interim certificates. So interim certificates are usually every month throughout the construction process, and it's the client paying for the work to date. And then the practical completion certificate is what it says when it's practically complete. The contract administrator will collate and issue a schedule of defects, which is after practical completion. They also issue the certificate of making good defects, which is after that schedule. The contractor makes good the defects, and then they issue the final certificate, which when the works are completely complete and the final account can be settled as well. So that's what a contract administrator might do, and obviously you've seen what a lead consultant can do. So basically what we're just trying to make sure that you understand is that those two things are separate. Even if they're being done by the same person, those are two different parts of their role. As an architect, it's something that you also need to think about from a business perspective to make sure that you have time to do both those roles. If you're being a lead consultant and a contract administrator, they're both quite intense jobs, and you need to make sure that you have enough time and therefore have been paid enough fee to cover doing both those tasks. So that's 5.8. 5.9 is site processes, quality monitoring, progress recording, payment and completion. So this again is quite a lot of detail for this video. So I'm going to kind of very high level touch on it, and then maybe if you guys want another video that is like literally these things, we can talk about that. Essentially, again, we're going to do it as if this is a traditional contract, but basically my understanding of this is from the role of the architect, who's assumed to be acting as contract administrator, because we're assuming it's a traditional contract. Traditional contracts, as we've already mentioned, are quality driven. So when it says quality monitoring, it's how that's done, because what I'm trying to explain to you guys is why 5.9 I think is in relation to traditional contracts, because of the architect's responsibility usually under a traditional contract, which is that of being contract administrator. And a contract administrator inspects the work in progress. And you would need to check what a contract says about inspection, but it's key to understand that an architect is only required to inspect work for the purposes of certifying contracts. So as we've said, the contract administrator issues interim certificates, which is what it means by certifying what we mean by certifying contracts. So they're inspecting the work, as I've said, to make sure that the employer is paying for work that has been done in accordance with the contract. The architect does not go on site during construction as a contract administrator to spot defects on behalf of the contractor or to kind of inspect the work in terms of quality assurance in that sense. They're checking that it is done to the quality as per the specification of the contract, but not looking for problems themselves. Architects inspect progress as well as quality, and this is a good reason, as we've said, as to why the designer is basically making sure that the project is proceeding in adherence with the design itself. Now, basically, that's what a contract administrator does on site. They go to site to inspect that work is completed in accordance with the contract documentation, so the drawings basically, and then if it is completed in accordance with the contract drawings, then they would put it in their interim certificate, i.e. the employer would be instructed to pay for it because it has been done correctly and to the correct quality of the contract documents. So that's kind of the process of them going to site and monitoring the quality themselves. The progress recording, you would usually just make a note of everything that you've seen on site. There'd be photographs of the site that you visited. A lot of the time, you go to site more regularly than you do for the interim certificates. The interim certificate is issued once a month. You'd maybe go every 2 weeks to make sure that you're there for certain things. You might request that the contractor has you come to site to see certain particular quality items being fitted or how they are being dealt with before any work gets covered up and you can't inspect it anymore. And then, as I've said, payment is then made based on what has been done in accordance with the contract, and completion is completion when items within the contract have been completed. So say you were there to see like some large sliding doors fitted, and then that piece of the work is complete and in adherence with the contract, and then it can be paid for. And then there's obviously final practical completion, and then the final certificate when everything, including defects, is fully complete. So that's really just how a traditional contract runs, which we should maybe do another more detailed video on. But other site processes, there's like testing and certified products that you might be specifying in your specification. Building control are doing their own inspections at the same time as well, and they are inspecting that things are done in adherence with building control regulations. A contractor might be asked to make samples or mock-ups of certain things. A lot of the time, this is also linked to like planning. If there's like stonework on a building, they might be asked to make a sample panel for inspection, and then the rest of the work is to be done that same way. So you might ask for that, but you might ask for off-site mock-ups if there's specific joinery and things on a job. That might be a way of also quality monitoring and making sure things run correctly on site. One of the best books to look at for this is The Good Practice Guide to Inspecting Works from the RIBA. I need to hold stuff over here. I keep forgetting that. This book is really, 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 really good. Basically, it's telling you what an architect does look for on site, and also what are kind of some of the common things that they would need to look for particularly. But as I've said, essentially what a contract administrator is doing on site as the architect is inspecting the work in progress and basically seeing that it has been done in accordance with the contract documents, and therefore the client/employer can pay for it. That is essentially most of it. I think that really covers 5.9 is essentially about it's presuming that it's a traditional contract, which is why you're tested on traditional contracts at part 3, is because traditional contracts traditionally have a lot more involvement from the architect than other kinds of contract, depending on what role different people are carrying out. But I think that kind of covers it. Although, like I say, there's a hell of a lot more detail there. So if you guys want another video that looks at these things in more detail, and like I say, I think we'll do a video on like contract types generally, but we might do a specific video on traditional contracts and the things that usually about traditional contracts get brought up at part 3, because they are tested a lot, and as is design and build. But yeah, that's 5.9. Okay, guys, we're finally here. It's 5.10. We've been on a long journey through all the professional criteria, and I particularly feel that from my illness my brain is fried during this particular one. But even as I say, building procurement is like one of my favourite topics. But I think this is probably the worst of the videos. But anyway, 5.10, claims, litigation and alternative dispute resolution methods. So this one is easy, to be fair. It's quite a closed topic as opposed to some of the others, which are kind of terrifying. So essentially, I see this in 2 different parts. There's claims, which is claims in terms of semantics, would usually mean claims under a contract. So usually they're ways of making requests for extra payment through the contract, as we've talked about. So there's different ways to make claims: through express terms, implied terms, or through moral obligation, which is like fairness. So my business partner did once do this on a construction contract. The contractor put a lot of money into pricing a certain part of the work that then was taken out of the contract, and the client provided themselves. And so some monies was given to the contractor to make up basically for the monetary loss that they would have suffered from not be actually able to do the work that they were originally going to be doing under the contract. That's a kind of claim that's a moral obligation, where to balance the books and to be fair, as we've said, a contract administrator is being fair, you might make that. Also, as I've said, claims such as an extension of time claim, though that's not a monetary claim, however it's often sought alongside a loss or expense claim for compensation through the contract for the cost of a delay. But basically they're all like different claims to be brought under the contract. Now, I think the reason that claims is here as a word in 5.10 is that obviously claims is one of the main things, because it's about money, that might lead to disputes under the contract. And so basically you need to understand what people might claim for under the contract, and then why there might be disputes. So like another thing under a contract is liquidated damages, which is where if a contract is late by a certain period of time over the agreed sort of end date of the contract, an employer, so the client, can charge costs to the contractor only if they're actually making a monetary loss. But if there's something like a commercial building that they're doing work on, and while that commercial building is closed, the client isn't making any money, they can charge for what they would be losing to the contractor for every period of delay. So these is another kind of claims. But usually, obviously, they're claims involving money in some way that lead to disputes. And so that leads to the second part of 5.10, which is litigation and alternative dispute resolution methods. So we've touched on this in the past in other videos, as it comes up in other professional criteria, although I can't remember exactly which ones. Litigation obviously means court proceedings. It's the settlement of a dispute in public court, either criminal or civil. And it's also seen as the most serious, the most expensive, and obviously public form of resolving disputes. Due to this, alternative dispute resolution, which is something you're going to hear a lot during your Part 3 and during your career, means ways of resolving disputes other than litigation. And it's become the main ways to resolve disputes in contracts or within the contract. The contract itself will record what methods of dispute resolution has been agreed between the contracting parties, so the employer and the contractor, and who is to carry out those processes. So we're going to touch on them in a minute, but one of them is arbitration, and the RIBA can oversee arbitration or adjudication, so you can put them in as how you're going to do that if anything should occur. So the idea of alternative dispute resolution is to maintain working relationships and prevent the need for any combative litigation. The alternative methods are less or more formal, with again litigation being the most formal and also the most binding resolution that comes out of it as well. So how they're referred to is a little bit weird, but consensual resolutions, which basically means that it's not necessarily a legal finding, it's that both parties have come to an agreement, essentially. So consensual resolution agreements are done through mediation, conciliation, or neutral evaluation. Those are ways of dispute resolution. The most common that you'll hear about in dispute resolution is mediation, which is kind of the lowest level of dispute resolution, literally just mediating the situation and trying to come to some sort of agreement that we can then move forward based upon. And then the other type is binding resolution, which can be appealed to a lesser or greater extent. Expert determination is one of those, and then the more well-known, adjudication, arbitration, or litigation, which all step up in kind of seriousness and also in terms of the most binding resolutions. Litigation being the one that obviously is the most difficult to appeal, and you can only appeal up to a certain point, being kind of the Supreme Court, and then that's the decision that you're being given. A lot of contracts encourage the use of mediation to first resolve disputes, only escalating them if an agreement cannot be reached between parties through mitigation. And you'll also be taught all of these dispute resolutions much more in your Part 3 course. So if you want to know more about the differences between them, they're gonna teach you that then. But we can touch on them in another video if you would like. And yeah, give you more detail if anyone wants that. But it's kind of self-explanatory. But yeah, basically, as always with any contract stuff, you are referring to the contract for what there is. So the contract that the two parties have signed that is governing the construction will tell you what is to be done if there is a dispute and how to go through the dispute resolution process. And an architect or a contract administrator will have drafted part of that, and they will know what kind of dispute resolution methods apply. But basically, you want to prevent having to go to litigation unless you really, really have to, because it is going to be very expensive, and most disagreements are quite minor disagreements, and mediation is really fine to sort out any of those problems. Okay guys, so we end on a bit of a downer about disputes, but that is PC5 building procurement. I hope that helps, because I feel like that was kind of a bit of a crazy video. I've tried my best to kind of stay high level on these topics, but for building procurement, it is quite difficult to kind of just give you guys a little bit of information. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it won't make any sense. So that's kind of what I kind of worry about with it. If you would like more information in any of those topics or anything we've even vaguely mentioned, put it in the comments below and I will do a video more specifically on it. Like I say, I'm already going to plan to do a video on different contract types, and then we might do another video more on traditional contracts and how they work and the kind of things that commonly come up in them. Another book that I didn't mention during the video, but that we will have a link below to some extracts of, is JCT Contract Administration Pocketbook. Usually in your Part 3, you'll be referring to a specific contract for some questions. A lot of the time that's a traditional contract, because like I say, it gives an architect a very specific role as contract administrator that you can be tested against. Usually it's a JCT standard building contract that they use to do that. So that book is really helpful, because a lot of the sort of standard problems that come up in contracts, it literally tells you how you would resolve that through the contract. But like I say, the main thing with contracts is if you're in a contract and there's a dispute, or you're unsure of how to do something, or you don't know how to appeal appeal is not what I mean. I mean like review certain things like an extension of time. The contract particulars, the documentation itself tells you how to do that. So you always would refer to the contract that you're working under. It doesn't matter what kind of contract it is, doesn't matter if it's an RIBA building contract, a JCT building contract, NEC, or any other kinds, you would refer to the specific one that you have signed. That tells you how you are progressing. And that's why it's so important to procure a building and then to agree to a contract that's going to best serve the interests of the client and what they're actually trying to achieve with that project. That is essentially what PC5 is. As I say always, I hope it was useful, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your patience with these videos. This series is now completed, so please do drop a like on the video if it was helpful, because it helps other people see it. And if you need any more detail on anything that we should cover in a bit more detail on the channel, then please do drop it in the comments below and I will do that. So thank you for your time in watching this and all the rest of the others. If you've watched all of them, that is an undertaking. It's really appreciated, so thank you. Have a great day wherever you are, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. I definitely need a new camera situation because waiting for it to turn on is terrifying. To edit this. Which I do, so it's fine, it's my problem. We're done because that was fucking terrifying. That's all I'm saying. That is a difficult topic.